Hello, and welcome to the To Be Like Christ Bible Study Podcast, where we explore and explain one chapter of the Bible at a time. My name is Luke, and I'm your host, and today's chapter is Genesis 13. Let's read the text together. Grab your phone, grab your Bible. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version, and while I find it in my Bible, if you have a moment, hit the follow or the subscribe button on your podcast player so we can study together again sometime. Genesis 13 has 18 verses. Let's go ahead and read the chapter. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negev. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold, and he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of God, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. That is our text for Genesis chapter 13. Thanks for joining me for another study today. This chapter is a little bit shorter, a little bit, I think, just more straightforward than some of the other ones that we've looked at so far, so I expect a little bit of a shorter study today. I always say that, and it always ends up being the same time, but I guess we'll see how it works out. Before we get started today, let me encourage you to check out the links in the description. There is a link to our website where you can download the PDF outline that we're going to be using to cover the material in this chapter. And there's a map on there. It's a different map from yesterday's study. It's zooming in on the land of Canaan and the Jordan River and the Negev and this area of the world. And this is going to be kind of the main stage on which a lot of the Bible plays out from this point forward. So you're definitely going to want that new map. So check out the links. Also, there's a link to Amazon where you can just buy the book and get all 50 outlines for the book of Genesis in one go. Before we go to our outline, though, let's remind ourselves of the context. Where have we been so far in the Bible? We won't review the whole Bible every time, but we're only 12 chapters in, so we can do it in a relatively short amount of time. Genesis 1 and 2, we have the creation of the world. Genesis 3, we have the first sin entering the world, and the world's big problem of sin and of death being introduced because of Adam and Eve's disobedience to God. Then we have the lines of Cain and of Seth growing and people multiplying over the face of the earth, but people got very wicked. So God decides that he's going to wipe them out with a global flood. He gives instructions to a man named Noah to build an ark to save his family and to save the human race from this great watery judgment that he's sending over all the face of the earth. Noah does that, gets on the ark with the animals, and they make it through the flood safely. They get off the ark, and then Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, become the fathers of all of the people on earth. We were introduced to one of the sons of Shem. His name was Abram in chapter 11, and it's his story now that that we're following through chapter 12, where he was down in Egypt, remember, because of a famine, and he lied to Pharaoh about Sarai, his wife, being his wife. He said, "Oh no, she's my sister," and God had to send plagues on Pharaoh and on Egypt to get the Pharaoh to return Sarai to Abram, and after that, the Pharaoh sent them away, and they're on their way back to the land of Canaan, this land that God had previously promised to give to the descendants of Abram, and that promise is going to be repeated in this chapter. God is going to make Abram into this great nation of people, his descendants at least, and from them, he's going to eventually solve this great sin problem that we were introduced to, and he's going to solve that through Jesus. But more on that later. Let's go ahead and get into our outline now, looking at our first section. When did these events happen historically? Abram was born in approximately 1996 BC. Talked about that and established that through the genealogical lines. He died in 1821 BC at 175 years old. Now, we find that out in Genesis chapter 25, but I'm going to tell you ahead of time. That tells you that how long we're going to be talking about Abram's life. We talked about 2,000 years of history in the first 11 chapters of the Bible. The next 11, we're only covering the life of one man, about 175 years. So as I mentioned, time is definitely slowing down, and we're focused in on Abram as the key character. The events that are recorded in this chapter, in Genesis 13, happen sometime within the life of Abram. I'm estimating it to be between 1921 and 1896 BC. So there's about a span of 25 years there. We know that in the last chapter, Abram left the land of Haran up north and he came down to Canaan. And so that's where I get that starting date from of 1921. And it's happening, these events are happening somewhere within that in the next 25 years. We don't have too many new characters to introduce, really just three that we've talked about before. One is going to take a more prominent role, though. First, we have Abraham. He was a man who was originally from Ur of the Chaldeans, who moved hundreds of miles to Canaan because God instructed him to do that. Probably took a lot of faith to do that. We have Sarai. Sarai is Abram's wife, who is now back with him after he received her back from Pharaoh. And then we have Lot, and Lot is going to be highlighted a little bit more as we build out his story and what's going to happen to him. Lot was Abram's nephew, but he had gone to Canaan with him. And now we have our all-important map. So hopefully you have it in front of you, and that's going to be super helpful. At the opening of this chapter, Abram is leaving Egypt, and he's moving his family back to the area east of Bethel, where he had built an altar in Genesis chapter 12, the beginning of Genesis chapter 12. So he's returning to the place where he was before the famine that drove him down to Egypt. And this is the promised land. This is the land that God promises that he's going to give to Abram's descendants. Up to this point, Abram and Lot have been traveling together, but that's going to change, and we'll talk about that in our outline section. But Abram settles in Canaan. Lot settles in the Jordan River Valley. Canaan is to the west of the Jordan. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about Lot choosing to go east. Abram chooses to go west. At the end of the chapter, Abram moved to the Oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron. Hebron is roughly 25-30 miles to the south of Bethel. Now that we've covered our first three key questions, when, who, and where, let's talk about our outline, break it down, understand what we just read. I've got this chapter broken down into two sections. So the first section is going to be verses 1 through 13, and the second section, verses 14 through 18. So our first section I've entitled, Abram and Lot separate after returning to Canaan. So we're going to see a divide here, and this is also going to set up Lot's story. Lot kind of has a storyline of his own, and it's, let's just say, not all positive. We'll discuss him a little bit later. After lying to Pharaoh in Genesis chapter 12 about Sarai being his wife and God having to send plagues on Pharaoh to get Pharaoh to give Sarai back to Abram, Lot, and Sarai leave Egypt. Pharaoh actually directs his men to kind of kick them out of Egypt. So then they travel through the Negev, which is southern Canaan, and they return to Bethel. Now, Abram is described as being an extremely rich man. Now, we talked about how some of his riches came from Pharaoh. Originally, when Pharaoh took Sarai, he treated Abram very well. He really liked Sarai, and so he treats her what he thought was her brother very well. He gives him servants, animals, flocks, herds. And so that's one of the ways that Abram becomes very rich. And I'm sure there were other factors that contributed to that as well. But he's described as being a very rich man with an abundance of livestock. And his nephew, Lot, also had some pretty sizable herds. Between the two of them, they end up running into trouble. They have so many animals that there's not enough pasture land to support them, and their herdsmen are arguing with each other. And you have to think that the size of their herds must have been incredible, because the earth isn't that populated at this time. It's not like there's a land shortage, and they've got this pretty sizable region which they have all of their flocks, and yet they still don't have enough room. And so the solution that gets proposed is that they need to split up. Abram goes to Lot, and he gives Lot the choice of the land. He says, you can look to the west. Over there is Canaan. You could take your flocks over there. Or look to the east where the Jordan River is, the Jordan River Valley. And that's a lush land. And you could go over there. So we see Abram's generosity to his nephew. He says, you pick which land you want to go to. So Lot decides that he's going to go to the east. And he's going to live in the fertile Jordan River Valley he ends up near the city of Sodom. We're going to find out that this was a very critical mistake by Lot. It's going to cost him quite a bit. And there's a lesson here about how chasing prosperity isn't always the best choice, but we'll come back to that in our application section. So Lot decides to go to the east, to the Jordan River Valley. He moves his tent around, no doubt, with his flocks, but he ends up kind of settling in Sodom. And we're told something about Sodom here, which we're going to learn more about later. The men of Sodom are described as wicked, great sinners before the Lord. This definitely reminds me of the way that the men were described who lived before the flood. And, I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of other statements describing men in such negative terms in the rest of the Bible, but these people are some special kind of wicked, evidently. Wicked, great sinners before the Lord. So that's all that we hear about for Lot and his progression at the moment. Again, we'll read about him later, but then we read that Abram goes and he settles to the west. He takes the opposite side. Lot wants the east. Abram says, okay, I'll go to Canaan and settle in the west, and that's exactly what he does. This brings us to the second section of our chapter, verses 14 through 18. God reaffirms his promise to Abram. So you remember, hopefully, from our last study, God made a very similar promise to Abram that he was going to make him a blessing to the whole earth, that he was going to give him the land of Canaan, and his descendants were going to live there, even though the Canaanites were living there currently. One day it would belong to Abram's descendants. And he tells him that he's going to make him into a great nation. A whole nation of people are going to come from his children. What we see in verse 13 is a reaffirmation of that promise. And again, I mentioned how this is definitely a promise you want to remember. It's very significant. And we talked about at the end of last chapter how when God says that he's going to bless the whole earth through Abram, he's going to do that because Jesus is one of the descendants of Abram. And so this is one piece of God's story that's going to be connected all the way through the next 2,000 years until we get to Jesus. And really, the promise is continuing still today because we, as people who live in the modern day, are still being blessed by Jesus and therefore still being blessed by Abram's family. Very important promise. It's prophetic in nature because not all of these things are going to happen in Abram's lifetime, but they're going to happen to future generations. God is reaffirming this here. God told Abram that he would give his offspring all the land that he could see to the north, the south, the east, and the west. He promised to make Abram's descendants as numerous as the dust on the earth. He said, if you can count the dust on the earth, then you can count Abram's descendants, which is basically to say no one can count them. They're going to be too many in number. In the final verse of the chapter, verse 18, we are told that Abram moves his tent to Hebron, which you'll be able to see on the map, as we mentioned, about 25-30 miles to the south of Bethel, where he was, and he builds an altar to the Lord there. So we see Abram's continued dedication to the God who brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans, brought him to Haran, got him out of Egypt and that trouble that he was in there, and has now brought him back to this land of promise. And Abram's going to remain faithful to God and continue to give his worship to the Lord. And so that really does it for Genesis chapter 13 as far as the overview that I've got today. I think we probably were a little bit shorter, especially than yesterday's study, but that's okay. We need a short chapter on a Friday when this one's going to be released. We do still have an application to talk about, though. I hinted at it a little bit earlier. Let's discuss it before we close. Here's something to think about as you make decisions, maybe for yourself or maybe decisions that affect your family, your children, your extended family. Do not put your soul in danger for the sake of prosperity. Money, in other words. Lot chose to live near a very wicked town, the town of Sodom, because the Jordan River Valley looked like an ideal place for somebody who was in the livestock business, and that he was. Sodom was not a spiritually healthy place. In fact, it sounds like Sodom was about the worst place that someone would want to go if they wanted to care for their souls. But apparently, its wickedness wasn't enough to dissuade him from moving there and moving his family there. And in the upcoming chapters, we're going to find out how dearly Lot paid for that decision. Lot may make it out alive himself, but there's going to be some collateral damage that happens to some people who are close to him. What we need to think about is that we should never allow the allure of money, of prosperity to lead us places where our soul or the souls of our family members are endangered. Paul writes to the Corinthian church in chapter 15, verse 33, "Do not be deceived. Bad company ruins good morals." It says, don't be tricked. You're gonna probably be tricked sometime or have the temptation in front of you at some point in your life that, I'm strong, my family's strong. We can interact with people who are immoral or people who don't share our values. If it's for the good of my pocketbook or my checkbook, and we'll only do it for a little period of time, it won't be that big of a deal, right? We're strong in our faith. We're strong believers in God. And what Paul is writing in 1 Corinthians 15 is, do not be deceived. Don't think too much of yourself than you ought to. Don't be deceived into thinking that these people won't impact you. Bad company ruins good morals. If we make our decisions based on prosperity and don't consider the company that we surround ourselves with, our companions, we'll grow to regret those decisions when we discover that we and our families are farther from God than we ever intended to be. Who your friends are, who you're surrounded by, is not a decision to take lightly. It's extremely serious. Who you spend time with, those people rub off on you. If they're good examples, they will help you to be stronger in your faith, help you along your way to heaven. If they're bad examples, they'll do nothing but drag you down. And while your faith may last, it very well could be that the faith of someone you love, like a family member or a child, is ultimately torn down by some of these people. So we have more to think about than just ourselves when we consider the question of who will we surround ourselves with. So there you have it. That is our Genesis chapter 13 Bible study. It is a Friday today, so for the next 2 days, I will not be uploading, but we'll be back, Lord willing, on Monday to talk about Genesis chapter 14. Maybe on Sunday, it would be a good idea to review what we've covered already. That way you can keep the context and the story kind of fresh in your mind and be ready for Genesis chapter 14 in the upcoming day. Just a thought, but thanks everybody for joining in, and Lord willing, I'll talk to you very soon.